For 31 years, Margaret never sat in that chair, not once, not on Christmas morning when every other seat was taken, not on the night her husband came home and wept at the kitchen table and needed her close, not even when her legs ached and the chair was right there, empty waiting. She would pull out every other chair in that kitchen before she would touch that one. Her children grew up knowing it without being told. Guests learned quickly. That chair belonged to someone who was not there. And the day Margaret finally sat down in it, the day she pulled it out and lowered herself into it without hesitation, after 31 years, her son Kevin walked in and had to grab the doorframe to keep himself standing, because he understood exactly what it meant. His mother had stopped waiting, or so he thought. What actually happened in the next 72 hours is something neither of them will ever be able to explain. His name was Daniel. He was 7 years old on the last day his parents ever saw him. That was 31 years ago. Margaret Chen was not a woman who complained. She never had been, even in the years when money was tight enough to bend. When she and her husband Robert worked opposite shifts just to keep the bills from stacking, she approached each day with a practical kind of grace. She made things work. It was how she had been raised, and it was how she raised her boys. The family lived in a small mill town that had seen better decades, the kind of place where everybody knew whose car was parked in whose driveway, where the church bazaar in September was still the social event of the year. They rented a narrow house on Elm Street with a porch that leaned slightly to the left and a backyard big enough for the boys to run themselves tired before supper. Daniel was the eldest. He had his father's wide-set eyes and his mother's particular way of tilting his head when he was listening, a slight lean to the left, as if sound reached him better from one side than the other. He was a serious child in the way that some children are serious, not unhappy, just present. He watched things. He noticed things other kids walked past. At 7, he could already name every bird that visited the feeder. Margaret had hung on the back fence, and he kept a little notebook, orange, spiral-bound, where he drew them in crayon with careful labels. His younger brother Kevin was 5 at the time. Kevin was the opposite of Daniel in almost every way, loud where Daniel was quiet, impulsive where Daniel was considered, always skinning a knee or climbing something he had no business climbing. The two of them together made up something complete, the way certain combinations do. Where Daniel held back, Kevin pushed forward. Where Kevin forgot, Daniel remembered. Margaret used to say they were two halves of one whole boy. Robert worked as a delivery driver for a regional food distributor. His route took him out before dawn most mornings, and some evenings he did not come home until the street was dark and the boys were already in bed. On those nights, Margaret would leave a plate covered in the refrigerator and sit by herself at the kitchen table for a few minutes before turning off the light. Not lonely, exactly, just aware of the shape of the life she was living. On the day it happened, Robert was working. It was a Saturday in early autumn, the kind of afternoon that smells of wood smoke and cut grass, when the light comes in low and golden and everything looks more beautiful than it has a right to. Margaret had set up her little stand outside the community center, selling hand-sewn aprons and kitchen linens at the neighborhood craft fair. It was a tradition she kept every year, and she had been looking forward to it for weeks. She had pressed her best tablecloth, laid out her goods in neat rows, and tied a yellow ribbon around each item she had saved for this particular sale. Daniel had asked if he could watch the older boys playing touch football on the far end of the recreation field. It was only 100 yards away. She said yes, or she meant to say yes, or she was distracted by a customer at exactly the wrong moment and looked up to find him gone, already walking toward the field, already beyond the edge of what she could see clearly without her glasses. She assumed he was there. She kept looking toward that end of the field, expecting to spot his blue jacket, the red stripes on the sleeve. When the game ended, and the older boys drifted off in different directions, she realized she had not seen him in a while. She started toward the field. She asked a few of the boys if they had seen a little kid in a blue jacket. They shrugged, already looking at their phones, already somewhere else in their minds. By the time the craft fair was packing up and the last of the afternoon light was gone, Margaret knew. She knew the way any mother knows, through the skin before the brain, through the stomach before the lungs. Daniel was not there. Daniel was not anywhere she could see or call or reach. The police came, neighbors came. People she barely knew drove slowly up and down the streets calling his name. They searched the woods behind the recreation center with flashlights. They knocked on doors. They printed his photograph and stapled it to telephone poles on every block for a mile in every direction. The orange notebook was found near the edge of the parking lot, its pages fanned open to a drawing of a sparrow with careful letters spelling out its name in green crayon. Robert came home from work to find his wife standing in the parking lot with a police officer speaking to him in a tone that people use when they do not want to say what they are actually saying. The weeks that followed are not easy to describe. There are things that happen inside a family when a child disappears that do not have names. It is not mourning, because mourning requires an end, a certainty. It is not hope, because hope requires some direction to point itself toward. It is something in between those two states, something that wears a person down slowly, that turns ordinary mornings into a kind of endurance test, that makes the smell of a child's shampoo on a pillow into something almost unbearable. Margaret kept working. She kept getting up and making coffee and going through the motions of the days. She kept Kevin in school and went to his teacher conferences and signed permission slips and made lunches and did all the things a mother does. But every night before she turned off the kitchen light, she looked at that empty chair and she did not move it. Robert was a man who expressed grief through motion. He filled the hours with action. He called organizations, attended meetings, sent photographs to databases that specialized in missing children. He drove to towns within a 100-mile radius and walked streets with printed flyers in his hand. When people told him to accept the possibility that Daniel was gone, he responded with a politeness that was clearly costing him something considerable. He never accepted it. He refused to accept it in the same quiet, stubborn way. He refused to let Margaret carry groceries when his back was already bothering him. It was a matter of principle. It was a matter of who he was. The years moved. Kevin grew up. He became the kind of young man his parents were proud of, thoughtful and hardworking, and careful about the people he let close to him. But he carried the absence of his brother the way some people carry an old injury. Not visibly, not constantly, but always there at the edge of awareness, aching in certain weather. He remembered things about Daniel that no one else remembered. The way Daniel whistled without opening his lips all the way. A soft sound, barely audible. The way he lined up his shoes by the door with the toes pointing exactly forward. The game they had invented involving a sock and the kitchen wall that had no name and no rules except the ones they made up as they went along. Kevin kept these memories without speaking about them. Often they felt too fragile for ordinary conversation, too easily broken by the wrong kind of attention. Margaret continued writing letters. She had begun writing them years earlier to a television program that helped families search for lost relatives, and though they had been unable to find Daniel, she had never entirely let go of the habit. She wrote when she felt hopeful. She wrote when she felt nothing at all. Sometimes the letters were practical and full of details. Sometimes they were 2 paragraphs long and said almost nothing useful. Just, he was here, he mattered. He is still being looked for. The show never aired their story, but Margaret kept writing. In the autumn of the 31st year, she sat down with Kevin on his birthday and said something she had never said before. She said she thought they should accept that Daniel was likely gone. She said she thought they might need to do something symbolic that Thanksgiving. Not a funeral, nothing like that, but something a candle. A dinner with his name said out loud, something to mark the passing of the years. Kevin drove home that night in silence. He told his wife what his mother had said. He sat on the edge of their bed and stared at the floor for a long time. Then he went to sleep and dreamed something he did not remember in the morning. What he did not know, on that particular night, was that 3,000 miles away, in a city he had never visited, A man was sitting up late with his phone in his hands, watching a video of himself that someone else had posted, a video in which he was explaining, carefully and haltingly, in a language he had mostly lost, that he remembered his name was Daniel, that he had been taken when he was small, that the man who raised him had been kind but was gone now, that he remembered his father's name was Robert, or something like Robert, and that he had tried 3 times before to find the family he had been taken from. And he was trying again. The video had been shared 11,000 times before Kevin ever heard about it. He did not find out from a stranger. He found out from a cousin who had seen it shared by someone she followed from a community page, who had seen it shared by someone they did not know, who had seen it on a page dedicated to reuniting separated families. The cousin called Kevin's mother first by accident, thinking she was calling Kevin's number. Margaret picked up the phone and said hello. The cousin said, "I think I need to show you something." Margaret looked at the video on her phone. She held the phone very close to her face the way she always did, because she still refused to get stronger glasses. She watched the man in the video speak. She watched the way he tilted his head slightly to the left when he paused to remember something. She set the phone down on the kitchen table and did not speak for a long time. Then she picked it up again and watched it from the beginning. And then she did something. Kevin would not understand until she explained it to him later. That evening, she walked to the kitchen table, pulled out the chair that had sat empty for 31 years, and sat down in it herself. She had never sat in that chair before. Not once. Not in 31 years. Kevin reached her 40 minutes later and found her still sitting there, in Daniel's chair, in the kitchen, with her hands folded on the table, and her eyes dry and her face very still. She held up the phone without saying a word. But when Kevin leaned in to watch the video for the second time, he noticed something neither of them had yet spoken about. Something in the corner of the frame, something the man in the video was wearing on his right hand, something that made Kevin's breath stop in a way that had nothing to do with air. Kevin had to watch the video 4 times before he was certain he was seeing what he thought he was seeing. On the man's right hand, on the smallest finger, there was a scar. It was old and faded, the kind of mark that a body makes over decades of quietly covering something over, smoothing it down until it is more memory than wound. But it was there. A thin, pale line along the outside of the finger, curved slightly, the way a scar curves when the original cut happened in a moment of motion rather than stillness. He knew that scar. He had been 5 years old when it happened, but he remembered it clearly, the way children remember things that frightened them, in full color, full sound, the whole scene intact. Daniel had caught his finger in the car door in the parking lot of the grocery store. Their father had been loading bags into the trunk. Daniel had swung the door shut before Robert's hand was clear of the frame. The sound it made, the way Daniel's face went white before it went red, the emergency room. The white paper on the table that crinkled every time Daniel moved. Kevin sitting in the plastic chair by the window, very still, holding his own fingers as if something might happen to them too. He put his thumb on the screen and enlarged the image, the scar on the man's finger, the way he tilted his head, the wide-set eyes that were unmistakably their father's eyes, the same particular spacing, the same slight heaviness in the brow that made Robert look serious even when he was laughing. Kevin called his mother into the room and showed her. Margaret looked at the scar for a long time. Then she simply nodded. Once, the way she nodded when she had already known something for longer than she had admitted. They reached out through the organization that had shared the video. There was a form to fill. There was a coordinator who responded within an hour, which surprised both of them. The coordinator asked for photographs, for details, for the specific kind of information that could be cross-referenced. Kevin sent everything. He sent photographs of Daniel from before the disappearance. He sent the details of the scar. He sent the date, the location, the name of the recreation center. He typed everything quickly that if he slowed down, he would lose the feeling of urgency. That was the only thing keeping the fear from reaching him fully. The coordinator called back in the morning. The man in the video had already provided his own details, His name, the one he had been given in the family that raised him, was Elliot. He was 38 years old. He worked in construction. He lived in a city he had moved to as a young adult, having aged out of the home of the people who had taken him in after the family that first acquired him had, in his words, treated him more like labor than like a son. He had learned to work hard early. He had built a quiet life. But the absence of origin had never left him. It had sat in the center of everything he built, a hollow place that nothing quite filled. He remembered very little Vietnamese. He had forgotten most of it by the time he was 12, but he remembered the sounds of it in certain situations. When he was very tired, when he was startled awake from a particular kind of dream. The sounds would come to him in those moments, not as words he could translate, but as texture, as warmth, as something that felt like before. He had tried 3 times to find his birth family. He had traveled twice on his own and once with a friend who helped him navigate. Each time he returned to the small mill town where he had grown up, the trail went cold. The records from that period were incomplete. The craft fair had not been photographed in any archive he could access. The police report existed, but the follow-up investigation had been minimal. The way investigations sometimes are when resources are stretched and years accumulate, and a case becomes old. The 3rd time he had returned and found nothing, a friend suggested he make a video. Put it out into the world. Tell the story in his own voice and let the network do what networks sometimes do. Carry a thing further than any single person could carry it alone. He had filmed it on his phone in his apartment, sitting at his kitchen table, speaking slowly and stopping often to find the right words. He posted it on a Friday evening without expecting much. By Sunday morning it had been shared by someone with a large following, and then by someone else, and then by someone else after that. Spreading outward, the way things spread in the current of people who recognize something of themselves in a stranger's longing. He had received many responses. Some were sincere, some were confused, some were from people who wanted to help and did not quite know how. And then Kevin's message arrived through the coordinator's system, with photographs attached, and Elliot sat very still at his kitchen table for a long time before he opened them. He looked at the photograph of Daniel at age 4, standing in the backyard on Elm Street, squinting into summer sunlight with his head tilted slightly to the left. He closed his laptop. He walked to his window and looked out at the street below for several minutes. Then he walked back, opened the laptop, and looked at the photograph again. For a long time he typed, "I think this might be me." The video call happened 2 days later. It was a Thursday evening, which neither family would ever forget, though they could never have told you why Thursday felt significant. Perhaps it was simply that significance settles onto whatever container it is given. Margaret sat at the kitchen table with Kevin beside her. Robert sat in his armchair in the corner of the room, positioned slightly apart from the others, the way he always positioned himself when something important was happening. Close enough to be present, far enough to have room for whatever he was feeling. Elliot appeared on the screen. He was wearing a gray work shirt. He had not shaved in several days. His eyes, when they found the camera, were the exact shape and distance apart that Robert's had been at 38, which was a thing none of them could say out loud in that moment, but all of them registered somewhere below language. Nobody spoke for a long time. It was Margaret who finally said something. She said simply, "Hello." And the word she said it with, the quality of it, the way it contained everything she had held for 31 years in the shape of a single ordinary syllable, made Elliot press his hand flat against his mouth. He said hello back. His voice was steady, but the effort of keeping it steady was visible on his face. They talked for 2 hours. The coordinator remained on the call as a quiet presence, intervening only when needed. Elliot asked questions he had been carrying for decades. Margaret answered each one without hesitation, not because she had rehearsed the answers, but because she had been living with them for so long they had become as automatic as breathing. The craft fair, the yellow ribbons, the blue jacket, the orange notebook. At the mention of the notebook, Elliot went very quiet. He left the frame briefly. When he returned, he was holding something. He held it up to the camera. It was small and orange, spiral-bound, its cover worn and soft from decades of handling. Margaret made a sound that was not quite a word. Elliot said, "I have had this since I was small. I do not know why I kept it. I could not always remember what it meant, but I never threw it away." Robert, from his armchair in the corner of the room, cleared his throat once. Then he stood up and walked to the kitchen and stood behind Margaret's chair and put his hand on her shoulder without speaking. "Kevin," said Daniel. He said it quietly. Not as a question, not as an announcement, just as a name spoken to the person it belonged to for the first time in 31 years. Elliot looked at the camera. His expression was not easy to describe. It was the expression of someone who has been holding a weight for so long that when someone finally reaches out to take part of it, the relief and the disorientation arrive at the same time. He said, "I used to draw birds." The arrangements were made quickly. Elliot would travel within the week. There were practical matters, time off work, transportation. The logistics of crossing a distance that had been insurmountable for 3 decades and could now be covered in the length of a single afternoon's drive. Margaret told no one outside the immediate family until Elliot's travel was confirmed. She was afraid of something she could not fully name. Not that it would fall through, not exactly, but that naming it too loudly before it was real might disturb something fragile. She had learned over 31 years to be careful with hope. It did not survive rough handling. The night before Elliot arrived, Robert could not sleep. He lay in the dark and listened to the house and thought about all the nights he had lain in the same dark, thinking about the same absence, and how strange it was that the last of those nights felt exactly like all the others, that the border between the old life and the new one would not announce itself until it had already been crossed. Kevin drove to meet Elliot at the station. He had asked to go alone. Margaret had agreed without asking why, because she knew without needing to be told. Kevin had his own 31 years to account for, his own version of the grief, the specific loss of growing up as an only child when you had begun life as a brother. He stood on the platform with his hands in his coat pockets and watched the passengers come through the doors. He had looked at Elliot's photograph so many times in the past week that he felt he would recognize him immediately, the way you recognize the answer to a question the moment it appears, as if you always knew the shape of it. The platform was crowded. Kevin scanned the faces. And then the crowd shifted and there was a gap. And through the gap he saw a man in a gray jacket, walking with his bag over one shoulder, scanning the platform with the same expression Kevin was wearing, looking for the same face Kevin was wearing. Kevin raised one hand. Elliot stopped. He looked at Kevin for a long moment, his head tilting very slightly to the left. Kevin felt something move through his chest that he had no name for. Something old and physical, something that lived below thought. He took 2 steps forward. Elliot took 2 steps forward. They met in the middle of the platform, with the crowd moving around them on both sides, and Kevin reached out and put his hand on Elliot's shoulder, and Elliot put his hand on Kevin's arm, and they stood like that without speaking, while the station went on being a station around them. They were almost to the car when Kevin's phone rang. He looked at the screen. He stopped walking. It was not his mother's number. It was not his father's. It was a number he did not recognize, with an area code he could not immediately place. He would have ignored it on any other day. But something made him answer, some instinct he could not account for, and when he heard the voice on the other end, he went very still in the middle of the parking lot, with Elliot standing beside him, and the color left his face entirely. The voice on the phone was a woman's voice, calm and professional, from a non-profit organization that specialized in documentation for people affected by historical child displacement cases. She was calling because Elliot's case file, submitted 3 years earlier during his second search attempt, had been flagged for follow-up. She was calling because new DNA registry legislation had recently passed, and she wanted to let him know that voluntary testing was now available at no cost, if he wished to pursue official confirmation alongside any reunion he had already achieved through other means. Kevin listened. He said yes and thank you, and wrote down a number. He hung up the phone. He looked at Elliot standing beside him in the parking lot holding his bag, waiting with the patient stillness of a man accustomed to waiting. Kevin said, "That was about the DNA testing. There is a program now. It would be official confirmation." Elliot looked at him for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Do you need it?" Kevin thought about his mother sitting in Daniel's chair. He thought about the orange notebook. He thought about the scar on the small finger of Elliot's right hand that he had recognized from 33 years away, across the screen of a phone, in the middle of the night without a single moment of doubt. He said, No, I don't think we do." They drove the rest of the way without speaking much. The radio played something instrumental and low. The road they traveled passed through the part of town where Kevin and Daniel had grown up, and Kevin drove slightly slower than necessary through those streets without quite realizing he was doing it, and Elliot looked out the passenger window at the houses going by, each one its own closed world of light and warmth, and said nothing. But as they turned onto Elm Street, Elliot straightened almost imperceptibly in his seat. His hand, resting on his knee, went still. He was looking at the houses with a different quality of attention now. Something more focused, the way a person looks when they are listening very hard to something just below the threshold of hearing. Kevin watched him from the corner of his eye and said nothing. They pulled up in front of the house with the porch that still leaned slightly to the left. Robert's truck was in the driveway. The kitchen light was on. Through the window, from the street, you could see the outline of the kitchen table, the chairs around it, the small lamp above it, casting its familiar circle of yellow. Elliot looked at the house for a long moment before he opened the car door. He got out slowly. He stood on the sidewalk with his bag over his shoulder and looked up at the porch, at the slightly leaning rail, at the light in the kitchen window. The evening was cold and still. Someone 2 houses down had a fire going, and the smell of wood smoke drifted across the street in a way that was both ordinary and, in this particular moment, almost too much. Kevin came around the front of the car and stood beside him. He did not rush him. He understood, in some wordless way, that this moment required whatever time it required. Elliot reached into the pocket of his jacket and took out the orange notebook. He held it at his side, not looking at it, just holding it. Then he walked up the path to the front door. Margaret had heard the car. She was standing in the hallway when they came in, having moved there from the kitchen in the last minute, because she could not decide whether to be sitting or standing, and had compromised by doing neither, just standing in the in-between space, in the hallway, with her hands at her sides and her face very composed in the way that faces are composed, when enormous amount of effort is going into making them appear that way. She looked at Elliot standing in the doorway. He was tall, taller than she had expected, though she could not have said what she had expected. He looked like his father in the eyes and around the forehead. He looked like someone she knew. He looked like someone she had always known, which was the strangest thing, the way recognition is always also a kind of strangeness. She said his name. She said Daniel, and then she said Elliot. She said both names, one after the other, as if she was offering him something, as if she was saying, "Whichever one you need, I have it. Both of them are yours." Elliot looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was tight. The effort of the last week was visible in his face, the way exhaustion is visible in the set of the shoulders rather than the eyes, a kind of compressed weight. He held out the orange notebook. Margaret took it. She held it in both hands and looked at it without opening it. The cover was worn thin at the corners. The spine was soft from years of handling. She turned it over once, then back again. Then she looked up at him. He said, "I kept it because I thought if I ever found out who I had been before, I could give it back." She opened the cover on the inside. In the handwriting of a 7-year-old in green crayon was his name, Dan, followed by their address on Elm Street. He had written it there the same afternoon she had made him do it, after he had lost a library book, and she had told him, "From now on, your name and address go inside, everything you want to find its way home." She closed the notebook. She pressed it against her chest for a moment. Then she put her arms around her son and held on to him. She did not make a sound. She had used up sounds somewhere in the last 31 years. What she had left was grip. She held on with both arms and her eyes closed and the orange notebook pressed between them, and Elliot stood very still and let himself be held, and after a moment his own arms came up and completed the circle. Robert had come in from the other room. He stopped in the doorway to the hall and watched. He was a man who had spent 31 years not accepting, who had maintained his refusal to surrender with the same steady energy other men put into building things. He looked at his wife, holding his son in the hallway of the house they had lived in together for 35 years, and he put one hand flat on the doorframe, and he breathed out very slowly, like something long held was finally being set down. Kevin had moved to the far end of the hallway. He stood against the wall, with his hands in his pockets, and watched his parents and his brother. He was 36 years old. He had grown up knowing what it was to be a younger sibling without a sibling to be younger than. He had grown up with an absence that had shaped him the way rivers are shaped by the land they run through. Not broken by it, but defined by it in ways that went all the way down to the floor of what he was. He watched Daniel stand in the hallway and hold their mother. He thought about a sock and a kitchen wall, and a game with no rules that they had made up as they went along. Later that evening, after the neighbors who had been called over had gone home, and the plates had been cleared and the house had grown quiet, they sat around the kitchen table together, all four of them. Robert and Margaret and Kevin and Elliot, whose other name was Daniel, whose name was both now, all of them at the table where one chair had been empty for 3 decades. Elliot was trying to remember words. They came back to him in clusters, in the way things return when the context is finally right. Suddenly, and without warning, words he did not know he had retained surfacing when spoken to him, or when the smell of something in the kitchen reached him, or when Margaret used a particular intonation he recognized from a place far below conscious memory. He used his phone to fill the gaps. He typed what he wanted to say and held it out, and Margaret typed back, and they talked this way for a long time, laughing sometimes at the awkwardness of it. At the phone passed back and forth across the table as a bridge between them. At one point, Elliot typed something and held the phone out to Margaret. She read it. She typed back and handed the phone to Robert. Robert read it and handed it to Kevin. It said, "I used to wake up sometimes not knowing where I was in the night for years. And I would just lie there and wait for something to feel familiar. It never did. But now I think I know what I was waiting for." Nobody said anything in response to that. There was not a response to that. That language was quite up to. Kevin handed the phone back to Elliot, and Elliot set it face down on the table. Margaret got up and put the kettle on. Robert went to the shelf and found the old tin where he kept the cards they had saved over the years. Birthday cards, Christmas cards, the occasional postcard from a relative in another state. He opened the tin and rooted around in it for a minute and then pulled something out. He set it on the table in front of Elliot. It was a photograph. A birthday photograph, Daniel's 7th, taken in this kitchen, at this table. In the photograph, a small boy in a striped shirt was leaning forward over a cake with 5 candles, his eyes half closed, his cheeks full of air. Elliot picked up the photograph. He looked at it for a long time. Then he set it back down on the table, very gently, the way you set down something you are not yet ready to fully hold, but are beginning to. The kettle began to whistle. Margaret came back to the table with 4 cups and a pot, and she moved with the ease of a woman in her own kitchen, doing the thing she had done 1,000 times, and she set a cup in front of each of them, and she sat down in her own chair, and the table was full in a way it had not been in 31 years, and she poured the tea. Elliot stayed for 5 days. The second morning, he and Kevin walked to the recreation center and stood at the edge of the old parking lot. The asphalt was cracked now. The lines faded. There were new benches along the path that had not been there before. They stood there for a while without saying much. Kevin pointed out where the craft fair had been set up. He pointed to the section of the field where the older boys had played football. Elliot stood at the edge of the parking lot and looked at the ground near the fence. Then he looked up and looked around, at the street, the buildings, the way the light came in from the west in the afternoon, and something in his face shifted. Something very small and very specific. The kind of shift that happens when a thing you have carried for a long time finally touches solid ground. He did not cry. He stood there for another minute, looking. Then he bent down and pressed his palm flat against the asphalt. The way a person touches something they are checking is real. Then he straightened up and they walked back. On the last morning, before Kevin came to drive him to the station, Elliot sat with Margaret alone at the kitchen table. They were past the phone by then. They had developed their own system, partial sentences, gestures, expressions that had begun to carry shared meaning. Margaret said something in English that Elliot mostly understood. Elliot responded in the mixture of languages he was reclaiming word by word, and Margaret listened with the focused attention of a woman who has had practice hearing meaning inside incomplete sentences. He asked her, haltingly, about the chair. He had noticed it. He had noticed that it was slightly different from the others. Different wood or different age, something in the patina that was not quite matching. He pointed to it and looked at her with a question he did not yet have the words for. Margaret looked at the chair for a moment. Then she said, simply, "That was yours." Elliot looked at the chair. He looked at the 3 other chairs around the table. He looked back at his own chair. Then he pulled it out from the table and sat down in it. He sat in it for a moment, just sitting, the way you sit in a place that was made for you before you were large enough to know it. His hands were on the table. His tea was in front of him. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window at an angle that made everything in the room look very clean and very still. Margaret watched him sit in that chair, and she did not say a word. She just picked up her own cup and held it in both hands, and looked at her son sitting at the table where his place had been kept for 31 years by a woman who had not known for certain that he was alive, but had not been willing to act as if he wasn't. Outside, a bird landed on the fence by the backyard feeder. Neither of them moved. Is there someone you have been meaning to reach out to? Someone you have let too much time pass with, and you are not quite sure anymore whether it is the distance that stopped you or the fear that they have stopped keeping a place for you?